The world has changed.
Breaking Strain by Arthur C. Clarke. Grant was writing up the Star Queen's log when he heard the cabin door opening behind him. He didn't bother to look around. It was hardly necessary, for there was only one other man aboard the ship. But when nothing happened, and when McNeil neither spoke nor came into the room, the long silence finally roused Grant's curiosity, and he swung the seat around on its gimbals. McNeil was just standing in the doorway, looking as if he'd seen a ghost. The trite metaphor flashed into Grant's mind instantly. He did not know for a moment how near the truth it was. In a sense, McNeil had seen a ghost, the most terrifying of all ghosts, his own. "What's the matter?" said Grant angrily. "You sick or something?" The engineer shook his head. Grant noticed the little beads of sweat that broke away from his forehead and went glittering across the room on their perfectly straight trajectories. His throat muscles moved, but for a while no sound came. It looked as though he was going to cry. "We're done for," he whispered at last. "Oxygen reserves gone." Then he did cry. He looked like a flabby doll, slowly collapsing on itself. He couldn't fall, for there was no gravity, so he just folded up in midair. Grant said nothing. Quite unconsciously, he rammed a smoldering cigarette into the ashtray, grinding it viciously until the last tiny spark had died. Already the air seemed to be thickening around him, as the oldest terror of the spaceways gripped him by the throat. He slowly loosed the elastic straps which, while he was seated, gave him some illusion of weight, and with an automatic skill launched himself toward the doorway. McNeil did not offer to follow, even making every allowance for the shock he had undergone. Grant felt that he was behaving very badly. He gave the engineer an angry cuff as he passed, and told him to snap out of it. The hold was a large hemispherical room, with a thick central column, which carried the controls and cabling to the other half of the dumbbell-shaped spaceship 100 meters away. It was packed with crates and boxes, arranged in a surrealistic, three-dimensional array that made very few concessions to gravity. But even if the cargo had suddenly vanished, Grant would scarcely have noticed. He had eyes only for the big oxygen tank, taller than himself, which was bolted against the wall near the inner door of the airlock. It was just as he had last seen it, gleaming with aluminum paint, and the metal sides still held the faint touch of coldness that gave the only hint of the contents. All the piping seemed in perfect condition. There was no sign of anything wrong, apart from one minor detail. The needle of the contents gauge lay mutely against the zero stop. Grant gazed at that silent symbol as a man in ancient London, returning home one evening at the time of the plague, might have stared at a rough cross newly scrawled upon his door. Then he banged half a dozen times on the glass in the futile hope that the needle had stuck, though he never really doubted its message. News that is sufficiently bad somehow carries its own guarantee of truth. Only good reports need confirmation. When Grant got back to the control room, McNeil was himself again. A glance at the open medicine chest showed the reason for the engineer's rapid recovery. He even essayed a faint attempt at humor. "It was a meteor," he said. "Tell us a ship this size should get hit once a century. We seem to have jumped the gun with 95 years still to go." "But what about the alarms? The air pressure's normal. How could we have been holed?" "We weren't," McNeil replied. "You know how the oxygen circulates nightside through the refrigerating coils to keep it liquid? The meteor must have smashed them, and the stuff simply boiled away." Grant was silent, collecting his thoughts. What had happened was serious, deadly serious, but it need not be fatal. After all, the voyage was more than 3/4 over. "Surely the regenerator can keep the air breathable, even if it does get pretty thick?" he asked hopefully. McNeil shook his head. "I've not worked it out in detail, but I know the answer. When the carbon dioxide is broken down and the free oxygen gets cycled back, there's a loss of about 10%. That's why we have to carry a reserve." "The spacesuits?" cried Grant in sudden excitement. "What about their tanks?" He had spoken without thinking, and the immediate realization of his mistake left him feeling worse than before. "We can't keep oxygen in them. It would boil off in a few days. There's enough compressed gas there for about 30 minutes, merely long enough for you to get to the main tank in an emergency." "Well, there must be a way out, even if we have to jettison cargo and run for it. Let's stop guessing and work out exactly where we are." Grant was as much angry as frightened. He was angry with McNeil for breaking down. He was angry with the designers of the ship for not having foreseen this God knew how many million-to-one chance. The deadline might be a couple of weeks away, and a lot could happen before then. The thought helped for a moment to keep his fears at arm's length. This was an emergency, beyond doubt, but it was one of those peculiarly protracted emergencies that seem to happen only in space. There was plenty of time to think, perhaps too much time. Grant strapped himself in the pilot's seat and pulled out a writing pad. "Now let's get the facts right," he said with artificial calmness. "We've got the air that's still circulating in the ship, and we lose 10% of the oxygen every time it goes through the generator. Chuck me over the manual, will you? I can never remember how many cubic meters we use a day." In saying that the Star Queen might expect to be hit by a meteor once every century, McNeil had grossly but unavoidably oversimplified the problem, for the answer depended on so many factors that 3 generations of statisticians had done little but lay down rules so vague that the insurance companies still shivered with apprehension when the great meteor showers went sweeping like a gale through the orbits of the inner worlds. Everything depends, of course, on what one means by the word meteor. Every lump of cosmic slag that reaches the surface of the earth has a million smaller brethren that perish utterly in the no-man's land where the atmosphere has not quite ended and space has yet to begin, that ghostly region where the weird aurora sometimes walks by night. These are the familiar shooting stars, seldom larger than a pin's head, and these in turn are outnumbered a millionfold again by particles too small to leave any visible trace of their dying as they drift down from the sky. All of them, the countless specks of dust, the rare boulders, and even the wandering mountains that Earth encounters perhaps once every million years, all of them are meteors. For the purposes of spaceflight, a meteor is only of interest if, on penetrating the hull of a ship, it leaves a hole large enough to be dangerous. This is a matter of relative speeds as well as size. Tables have been prepared showing approximate collision times for various parts of the solar system, and for various sizes of meteors, down to masses of a few milligrams. That which has struck the Star Queen was a giant, being nearly a centimeter across and weighing all of 10 grams. According to the table, the waiting time for collision with such a monster was of the order of 10 of the 9th days, say 3 million years. The virtual certainty that such an occurrence would not happen again in the course of human history gave Grant and McNeil very little consolation. However, things might have been worse. The Star Queen was 115 days on her orbit and had only 30 still to go. She was traveling, as did all freighters, on the long tangential ellipse, kissing the orbits of Earth and Venus on opposite sides of the Sun. The fast liners could cut across from planet to planet at 3 times her speed and 10 times her fuel consumption. But she must plod along her predetermined track like a streetcar, taking 145 days, more or less, for each journey. Anything more unlike the early 20th century idea of a spaceship than the Star Queen would be hard to imagine. She consisted of 2 spheres, one 50 and the other 20 meters in diameter, joined by a cylinder about 100 meters long. The whole structure looked like a matchstick and plasticine model of a hydrogen atom. Crew, cargo, and controls were in the larger sphere, while the smaller one held the atomic motors and was, to put it mildly, out of bounds to living matter. The Star Queen had been built in space and could never have lifted herself even from the surface of the moon. Under full power, her ion drive could produce an acceleration of a 20th of a gravity, which in an hour would give her all the velocity she needed to change from a satellite of the Earth to one of Venus.